Hello, Professor Hyman here, IBUS 620, Research Methods in International Business and Markets. I wanted to just mention that this section of IBUS 620 is brought to you by Jasmine Tea, which is delicious and keeps me awake without getting me too wired. Okay. We're going to talk about ethics in survey methodology, important topic. Ethics are also a key element of the SF State College of Business mission, so that's another important reason to talk about it. But we would talk about this topic anyway. Since it's a business school, the ethics lecture is going to be real short. Just kidding. Well, it will be short, but we have a very strong focus on ethics and serving underrepresented minorities and equality and freedom of speech at SF State, and some of what I'm going to talk about calls to those themes. All right, let's get started. Starting up here from the top left. It's ethics issues in survey research, as already mentioned. And the most important thing you need to think about is really the character of your population and sample. There are other issues which I'm going to mention which are also important, but this is one where if you get this right, you can avoid the possibility of doing widespread harm with your survey, and you just don't want to do that. Okay, so your character of your population or your sample, is it too young? And in our case, we have a very pragmatic number, less than 18 years old. Every survey subject that you work with should be over 18. Is your subject population too old? And I'm using an arbitrary number here. I think I'm more confident about 18 years for the lower bound for age versus the upper bound for too old, and I put approximately older than 70, and I'm not certain. You may want to raise that number, you may want to lower that number. That's a judgment call. Certainly it's the case that demographically we've got people remaining healthy into later years beyond the age of 65. That's happening routinely, so 70 might be a good number. You might want to go higher or lower though. But have a cutoff. What is too old? If you're working for an institution doing research or a firm, a private firm, the firm may have a policy about this and you should make sure you're informed about it. Also, is your population impaired? Are there some issues with cognition? Are they shy? Are they suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? Let me just close that parentheses. And that's also a population from a practical matter, unless these are your target market, so to speak, that you're going to have hassles getting approval for surveying these people. And indeed, your potential to do unintentional harm is greater with these groups. So the issues really become harm and distress if you pick the wrong population. Are you going to harm this population? Are you going to distress them? And I'm going to say this again and again, it's often unintended. You don't start out with a malicious intent to harm these folks, but it can happen in ways that are very unpredictable. Also, just from a pragmatic perspective, although harm and distress is by far the most important issue here, it is difficult to get approval for subject populations that are too young, too old, or impaired in some way. So with respect to the impaired question, if that's a direction you need to go because your target group, your target population is that group, you have to jump through the extra hoops to get approval for that particular target population, and it makes sense to do it. Otherwise, you want to avoid these, especially during a period when your students, or again, if you end up working for a public institution, these are crucially important. Together, what we call all these issues, what the folks who are suffering from these issues or subject to these issues are called, is vulnerable populations. And broadly speaking, you want to avoid surveying vulnerable populations. Okay, and for the reasons I just stated, let's talk briefly about some other ethics issues, because it's not just the population, even though I spend most of my time on that here, but surveys that can cause harm. This is also another topic that is important. If a survey is too long, somebody might get fatigued, doing the survey, and that's not a good thing at all. So you have to keep the length of surveys very reasonable. Shorter is better, but on the other hand, we like you to be greedy for data. So there's some tension there, and you as the researcher will find some balance between too short and too long. Also, tone of voice. If the items are worded in a kind of aggressive manner, or it's not polite enough. In other words, if you have an item, there can be a difference between a response when somebody asks a question like, "How old are you?" versus "Please state your age." Another thing, tone of voice can contribute problems the way you set up the possible choices in a response. So if you're asking somebody something sensitive like, "How old? What's your age?" Let's go back to that one. Instead of asking people to fill in the blank to write, in my case, 60 years old, that can be intimidating for some people. Some people don't want to express their age, but give them a range. Give them something like 18 to 25, 26 to 35, 36 to 45, 46 to 55, 56 to 65, older than 65. Give them check boxes, and you'll be surprised. People are willing to check that their age is within a certain range, but they may not be as happy about or they may feel that you're being intrusive or invasive by asking their exact age numerically. So that's a good example of how tone of voice can get into the actual question options, the response options. Then the last one I want to mention is the use of trigger words, which is almost always unintended. This is usually something that happens by accident, but you may be surveying a population where you're asking about, let's say, the proper term would be Asia Pacific Islanders, okay? But instead you use the term from Micronesia, Micronesians, or something like that, or you say Samoans, and again, the proper term at the moment is truly Asia Pacific Islanders for that group of people. That's a kind of a mild example, using a lot of slang. Slang might be an offensive trigger word to some folks, but mostly it's using proper nouns that can get you into trouble with trigger words. For instance, it might be more appropriate, and I'm not giving you a rule here, but it might be more appropriate to talk about Black Americans versus African Americans, okay? Or it might be the other way around. It might be better to talk about African Americans in a sentence rather than Black Americans, and depends who you're surveying, who's going to take offense. You want to keep it pretty sensitive. You want to be sensitive as the researcher to this issue of accidentally putting trigger words into questions or survey items. Okay, that's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this brief discussion on ethics in surveys, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thanks for listening. Professor Hyman signing off.